Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
Imagine a child growing up in a home thinking for years that she was an only child. Her parents never spoke of there having been any other children in her family, and there was no evidence anywhere to indicate the possibility. She grew up for years with this idea that there had only ever been her with her two parents. Then one day, in her early teen years, while exploring through the attic, she comes across a box with a photo album, and in it pictures of her parents looking much younger and holding two babies. And sitting beside them on the couch is a beaming little boy wearing a fireman's helmet and holding a welcome sign with her own name, scrawled in very childlike font and signed with a boy's name. Also in the box is that same fireman's helmet and a few other toys for a young boy, as well as some baby clothing, all for a little baby boy. Imagine the questions that now flood the young girl's mind.
Yeah, it's interesting because you do hear these kinds of stories, of people who really experience this kind of stuff. And I think a lot of kids at some point in their life think maybe they were adopted or something, But yeah, it would certainly be very confusing.
Yep, the 23andMe, those genealogy tests, the DNA tests, yeah. Up until the time that Darwin proposed his theory of gradual evolution of one species into others, there was no evidence that the human species had brothers or sisters of any kind. No bones, no abandoned cities or villages which clearly indicate anything non-human, no artwork on cave walls, and certainly no literature. Nothing on which to base the idea that in the past there had been other conscious volitional beings who were like us, and yet different from us. In fact, the Western world had the biblical text which told us explicitly that for millennia we were only children, created by God. But then we started exploring in the attic, metaphorically speaking. Subterranean caverns in Germany, other caves in South Africa, deserts and river gullies in Tanzania and Ethiopia, and many other such places, and in the process we found the metaphorical family photo album. Snapshots of our brother Neanderthal, our great-aunt Lucy, aka Australopithecus, our cousins Homo erectus and Homo habilis, and there was also that weird Uncle Piltdown who it turned out was actually a scam artist trying to wriggle his way into the family tree. Homo naledi, Homo floresiensis, Homo juluensis, Homo Denisovans.
Yeah, it's difficult, I think, for anybody in the modern world to put yourself back in that, time space and kind of think of how earth-shattering and kind of worldview shattering that must have been for a lot of people, religious or not. Just the realization that we were preceded,
right.
And so yeah, it's. The religious groups get a lot of, and deservedly so in many cases, they get a lot of flack for how they responded to some of these things. But, I think we have to also try to have some understanding given the overwhelming worldview of those times.
Right. And what you're saying there, Scott, you're using the past tense, but we're still dealing with these finds.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we're still dealing with the discomfort.
Yeah. Okay, so Scott and I, we're not going to lose any time in this episode itemizing all the different hominid discoveries that have been made. I'm expecting that our listeners will have heard a little bit about Neanderthals, probably about Homo habilis, aka handyman, Homo erectus, aka standing up man, Australopithecus, aka Lucy. The listeners only need to know that there are many hominid species with interesting names and stories. And if you really want the details, you can do a Google search or buy the book that I wrote a few years back, Standing on the Shoulders of Giants, Genesis and Human Origins. I'll put a link in the show notes for that. But the one species I do want to call attention to, though, is a new one that was recently discovered and reported half a year ago, Homo juluensis. There have been other new species discovered in the recent past, but this one stands out because its brain was hugely bigger than human brains today, and even significantly bigger than that of Neanderthals. If you like numbers, here you go. Modern humans have a brain size of 1,350 cubic centimeters. Neanderthals had one of 1,450, but juluensis had a brain size of 1700 to 1800
Wow.
cc's. And the belief is that just like bigger muscles means more strength, more brain means more brain power. So we can only speculate on the intelligence of Homo juluensis. And this one is also significant because it looks like they thrived in Eastern Asia between 300,000 and 50,000 years ago. And if so, they would have interacted with Neanderthals and humans. But like Neanderthals, they went extinct and were replaced by Homo sapiens.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing stuff. One of the great mysteries that I know we'll touch on it is, why us kind of thing.
Yeah.
Why are Homo sapiens the only ones to come out of all this?
Right.
And before the discovery of Juliensis, you could maybe make the argument, while we were advanced, we had bigger brains, and so we had greater skills and so on, and that's why we were able to continue to survive when some of these others didn't. But now here you go. Here's a, a hominid with a brain bigger than ours.
A lot
Wow.
Again, the numbers
a lot bigger.
1350 versus 1700, 1800. That's a lot bigger.
Yeah, that.
So one of the ideas is that we killed them off. But there's another idea that's out there. In the same way that explorers from Europe, when they went to South America and all the Mayans started contracting all kinds of diseases, smallpox, etc., because they had no immunity against the diseases we grew up with, there's that idea that when humans encountered Neanderthals and now juluensis, basically they just picked up our colds and our flus and died.
Yeah. Who knows? That's a nicer theory.
Yeah, I like it too. Better than we just killed them all off. But
yeah.
There you go. Now, here's the thing. Much of Christendom has been in denial about these other family members. AIG, for example, prefer to label every new hominid finding as either human or ape. They refuse to see any of them as intermediates in a long succession of evolving body forms. If the newly discovered fossil looks human enough, despite certain similarities to apes, then they'll say it was human with some kind of a musculo-skeletal disease like rickets or arthritis. Or they might wonder if those fossilized individuals were embarrassingly inbred, like that hillbilly family with all kinds of strange mutations and physical defects which bear testimony to their inconvenient sexual habits.
Yeah.
A few of them might draw comparisons to the Nephilim, the bizarre love children of depraved humans and supernatural beings, or perhaps some other even more irrational explanation. Those are the interpretations if the discovered fossil looks reasonably human. If it doesn't look human enough, then it's categorized as an ape. Those are the two options for AIG people. The fossil is either some form of human or it's an ape. Lucy, or Australopithecus, for example, in their mind is not a human ancestor, but an extinct ape. And this is because the intermediate species just don't fit into their young earth creationist worldview. Sometimes they're honest enough to say as much, but otherwise they'll just categorically deny what the scientists have to say. The decision made by the discoverers who actually dug the fossil up and dated it and measured every dimension, every angle, every nook and cranny in the bones. AIG will just say, they're wrong.
And by AIG, you mean Anwers-in-Genesis,
yes.
I assume. Yes.
Yes.
Well, what choice do they have in a sense, right? They're not going to give up their worldview. So basically, they're going to find some interpretation that.
That kind of denial is perfectly captured in the opening page of a biology textbook that I had a chance to look at. It was put together by a very fundamentalist group through the Bob Jones University Press, if you know who they are. It was meant to replace the textbooks that schools were previously using, textbooks written by world experts in biology. And on the opening pages, this new, revised, young earth creationist biology textbook said, if scientific conclusions contradict the Word of God, the conclusions are wrong, no matter how many scientific facts may appear to back them up. These people may prefer the story that our church fathers gave us, the one about us being only children, and they hold to that story because the Bible says differently and there can be no higher authority on scientific matters for them.
Yeah, it always amazes me that they don't recognize the fundamental flaw in that statement. If scientific conclusions contradict, they say, the Word of God, what they should say if scientific conclusions contradict what we think the Word of God says.
Exactly. Yeah.
But they have a very naive view of biblical understanding.
Yeah, they always talk about that plain reading, right?
Yeah, that plain reading. Yeah. Yeah. Plain reading. That's why we have 2,000 years of theology, because of the plain reading of the text.
Right. Yeah. Okay, let's be clear. These people that we're talking about, these deniers, this is not just a few scattered elderly people who attend some small country churches in rural Tennessee. It includes huge swaths of Christians of all ages, income brackets, varying degrees of college or university education. Pew Research have looked at this particular form of science denial for decades, documenting the large numbers of people who deny that humans evolved but have always existed in their present form. And Pew have correlated their responses with their race, their age, their gender, and what kind of Christianity with which they're affiliated. And although the numbers of people sticking to that level of science denial could vary widely, depending on those demographic parameters, there were a couple of standing observations that kept popping up. One of the most important trends, at least from the point of view for today's episode, was that amongst Christians, Catholics and mainline Protestants were 2 or 3 times more likely to accept human evolution, while white evangelicals were twice as likely to reject evolution. They ticked the humans have always existed in their present form box.
Yeah, that's interesting. Frankly, not all that surprising from my, kind of anecdotal experience.
It isn't surprising, but this is just putting numbers behind it. Pew have done the measurements, and they say these people are just in such opposition to the idea.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, Pew kept finding that trend year after year over a number of decades. They also noticed that there was definitely a trend across the board towards more and more Christians buying into the evolutionary origin of humans. But then in 2019, Pew noticed some anomalies in their data. It seemed that the answers that white evangelicals gave depended on how the question was asked. When Pew first started asking people about human evolution, they did it in 2 steps. First, they were asked if the person believes that humans have evolved over time or humans have always existed in their present form. Basically, when it's put that way, the question is really asking, do you accept Darwin's theory of evolution, or do you hold to how the book of Genesis portrays it? And if the respondents said yes, that they accept Darwin's theory of evolution, that humans have evolved over time, then they were asked if God had anything to do with that, or if it was just up to random natural processes. When the question was put to them in those 2 steps, 2/3 of them stuck to the creationist roots. This is the white evangelicals. But if instead of a 2-step process with 2 options at each step, if the Pew researcher asked only one question with 3 options, white evangelicals answered quite differently. Those 3 options were: 1, humans have always existed in their present form, or 2, humans have evolved and God was involved in some way, or 3, humans have evolved and God had nothing to do with it. When you put it this way, instead of the results being 2-1 in favor of the biblical literal view, now it was 2-1 in favor of humans evolving. This difference between the 1-step versus 2-step questions didn't happen when he talked to mainline Protestants or Catholics. Those 2 groups voted much the same way, whether it was 2 questions with 2 options or 1 question with 3 options. It was really a white evangelical thing. And another way to interpret these data, this phenomenon, is that white evangelicals weren't just making the decision on the scientific data, whether the evidence says that humans have been changing or not, but on the biblical and theological implications.
Right.
About a year ago, Pew published another update on this question, and in general their observations are that roughly 3/4 of Christians now accept the idea of human evolution. And that's more or less true irrespective of whether you're evangelical or mainline Protestant or Catholic. In general. But there are still some interesting differences. Even amongst religious people, there are still significant numbers that say that it was random, that God had nothing to do with how human evolution turned out. That idea is highest for Jews and Buddhists and Hindus, at 50 to 60%. It's about 10 or 20% among Catholics and mainline Protestants, and only 6% among evangelicals. So clearly, they're saying God had a lot to do with it. Another interesting observation is how many still to this day insist that humans have always existed in their present form. This is roughly 10 to 20% amongst all groups of Christians, which is pretty significant if you think about it, given that well over half of Americans identify as Christians. So Half of the U.S. population is about 175 million people, and 10 to 20% of that number is still 20 or 30 million people who still say humans have always existed in their present form. And, of course, it needs to be pointed out that amongst the various Christian denominations that believe humans have always existed in their present form, ranging from 10 to 20% depending on which brand of Christianity, the number is the highest for evangelicals at 26%.
Yeah.
A quarter of them.
Yeah, this whole realization that we may have been preceded by other hominid type species, or what you might call a human species, it adds a really different dimension to the evolution debate. Like, it's one thing for evangelicals to say, okay, I believe in evolution, and even I believe it's a random process. Maybe God's involved in everything, so he's involved in some way, but it's not a way that we can scientifically discern. So, or the ID people who say that it is a way that we can scientifically discern. But in either case, then you get to people, you get to the hominin realm, and now you say, well, even that was still an evolutionary process. It wasn't just a de novo thing where suddenly Homo sapiens appeared and everything before that was completely just animals. You know what I'm saying?
Totally.
And so that becomes a whole new set of issues for theologians and for Christians who have held certain views. It's like, just when we thought we were kind of getting comfortable with what science has been telling us for almost 200 years, all of a sudden this kind of comes into it and rocks the boat again, in a sense, or causes other questions that we might not like.
Okay, so let's distill what we've just been saying for the past 15 minutes into a few bullet points, because this is setting the stage for what I want to now announce, a new mini-series that we're going to be doing. So here's a few bullet points. Christianity in general is coming around to accepting evolution, even human evolution. A large number of them still insisting that God had something to do with that he was guiding human evolution, although a significant number of those will accept that it was all completely random. God did not intervene in any way. And there are still significant pockets of holdouts, biblical literalists holding to the Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden scenario 6,000 years ago, and this is especially true among white evangelicals. So for all of these reasons, it's time to do another episode on human evolution and how that impacts Christian theology, like you were just saying, Scott. Scott, I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm guessing that the theory of human evolution had some kind of impact on your Christian theology.
Yeah.
Before you got into the fundamentalist phase of your Christian journey, when you were just a kid in a fairly liberal Christian home, did human origins or creationism ever come up in your thought process?
Not particularly. But I do remember, however, as I've said, I grew up in a very progressive liberal church, so it wasn't a controversial kind of thing. However, I do remember in Sunday school, in that church, the Sunday school teacher, who was a lovely, great guy, but he was a Presbyterian background, and he had a pretty, even though behaviorally, because he loved to drink, he wasn't what you'd call a conservative, really, but in his understanding of the Bible, he was. He took it very literally and so on. And I remember him talking one time about origins and being quite incensed because I was an evolutionist. I believed in evolution. I was only probably 12 years old, but I was always very interested in science, and that's what scientists were saying. And I remember having arguments with him, even in that progressive setting, about that well, you can be a Christian too, if you believe evolution. God just did it that way, and so on. So now that's before I became a Christian. After I joined more of the fundamentalist movement, then I went on a quest, because while I'm told that to be a Christian, to be an evangelical, you can't believe in evolution. So then I went on a quest to see, well, maybe there are good arguments for not being an evolutionist. But that came later, yeah.
And when you did become that fundamentalist, that biblical literalist, I think that was in your late teens, you would have been saturated at that time with the young earth creationist worldview. Did you include any thoughts at all about human origins, Neanderthal fossils, or Lucy being discovered in the...
Yeah, not kind of what we're talking about, like in the sense of pre-hominids or pre-Adamites, that kind of thing. More just in the general sense of evolution of Darwin's, theory. So,
and it didn't rock your boat too much for the first short while, at least.
Well, it bothered me.
Okay.
It was there was a a dissonance for sure. It because I can remember very soon after I had a conversion experience that these were the kinds of questions that started to really flood my mind and caused me to go on quite a quest, reading a lot of the young Earth literature and stuff like that, and looking for ways to accommodate, I suppose. And in the beginning, I found them satisfying. I have to say, I was young. I didn't have any training or anything like that. So I found some of their arguments convincing,
Right.
Yeah.
So then this is where my own story begins, and I think yours is going to track with mine moving forward from here. And I think this is also true for many of our listeners. So I grew up for 20 years with the traditional Christian worldview, that idea of humans being created by God 10,000 years ago in a pristine, sinless state, perfect harmony with the animals and with God, and then God leaving us in charge of an essentially perfect creation, or earth. But we made a choice. We ruined that initial state. We became fallen. We rebelled against God. We ran away from God. All of that in complete denial of the scientific evidence that was accumulating against that worldview. That same view that is currently held by a very large fraction of Christians. And this is where you were at when you were in your 20s, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I know what you're saying, because there's this kind of interesting view. And I remember in being in a meeting once with a bunch of Christians, and something came up about Genesis, and there was kind of an assumption that nothing died.
Oh, yeah.
This kind of thing. And that it was kind of there was this magic. It was magical in a sense. Like, Eve bit that apple and everything started to change. That was kind of the understanding. And I think that's still very much.
Oh, totally.
People don't think it through very well, because, if they ate plants, then things died, obviously.
Right.
The plants died, at least, but I guess that doesn't count, but they don't think it through all that well. But
Exactly.
Somebody said something, and I wish I could remember what it was exactly, but then one of the other people said, well, how do you know that? How do you know there wasn't this before Eve ate the apple? And everybody just kind of, well, I don't know. How do we know? Like it just wasn't thought about that much. So.
And did that last for about a minute, and then people just moved on and started talking about something else? They just
true.
Swept it under the rug.
Yeah. It didn't get dwelled on. That's for sure. Yeah. Well, in a group setting, people, oh, well, it's not, we don't want to be controversial. You get all that kind of stuff.
Sure.
But yeah.
Okay, so that's where you were at, I was at, and I think many of our listeners were at. But now I want to go through a little bit of the journey that we've all been on, and I'm going to use an analogy. Scott, you're familiar with track and field, that sport called triple jump?
Well, you know what? Not specifically triple jump. I'm familiar with track and field, but...
have you heard of hop, step, jump?
Oh, yeah.
Right, that's triple jump, right?
Okay.
You take a hop, you take a long, quick run to get some momentum. Then you take a hop, a step, and then the big leap.
Okay.
Did you ever do that in high school?
Not that, I don't remember that in particular, but anybody looking at me is going to know that, athletics is not...
You undersell yourself. But I want to use that as a metaphor of what we do as Christians start off in that initial worldview, and how do we move out of that.
Right.
This is the path that I took, and I think it's true of our listeners. So the first step in your Christian worldview, triple jump, is to just allow for longer timelines. Humans appearing 50 or a couple 100,000 years ago instead of 6 or 10. And to do this, you typically have to get creative with the genealogies. You start adding generations or pretending that there were some there that weren't recorded. But you feel the pressure not to stray too far from Orthodox Christianity, so you leave everything else more or less intact. You still have this Adam who's created de novo from a lump of clay. You still have Eve coming from Adam's rib. The sinlessness and the perfect genetic and biological state, all that stuff you leave intact. And most importantly, they still make the choice that leaves the rest of us in a fallen, broken state, running away from God, that whole Eve biting the apple. So this is only cosmetically different from the traditional view. All that you've done is taken that small step of just saying longer timelines, more generations that aren't recorded in the Bible. So that's the first step in that triple jump metaphor. And it really shouldn't merit any mentioning, just like a car maker. A Toyota maker doesn't feel a need to come up with a whole new name of a car that's been upgraded with a CD player. A little change like that. But in this case, I do feel I need to set this step. It has to be pointed out because for a lot of people making that step, this is a tremendous leap. A leap away from that inerrant, infallible Bible that was otherwise intended to be taken literally. And so even this little change, just accounting for longer timelines to ease some of the cognitive dissonance, that's like a betrayal of our faith system. But we begin to feel we need to do something like this. So then we come to the second maneuver in our triple jump analogy. We've extended the timeline. Now you start rejigging the fundamental process by which the first humans came about. You admit that they weren't really created from lumps of clay on a divine potter's wheel, and you nervously chuckle to yourself as you think, okay, yeah, I guess it was only a metaphor. And yet you still nervously watch out for the thunderbolts that might be coming your way. So instead of the potter's wheel, you talk about God using biological evolution in some way that no intelligent design proponent ever ventures very far to describe. God somehow gets directly involved with the molecules. He starts orchestrating genetic changes and manipulating natural selection in some mysterious way, some unexplained way, to mold that mud into a long series of life forms, iterations on body plans and physiological adjustments, with a specific end goal in sight: hominids, but not yet Homo sapiens. For that last step, we would say that God takes a couple of those hominids existing on the planet at that time and gives them a massive upgrade, like an Australopithecus 2.0. Now complete with a distinct soul and a long list of superior cognitive abilities. For so many reasons, those new creations, the first Homo sapiens, have to be distinctly different and separate from all the other animals on the planet.
Yeah.
Did you do that, Scott? Did you take that step?
Yeah.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, pretty much how you're describing it. That evolution got to a certain point, and then all of a sudden we were then imbued with a soul, or given the image of God, as Genesis puts it. Yeah.
But we never explain what that looks like. What is that image of God? Yeah.
No, that's true.
I know. That's becoming increasingly frustrating for me, I've got to say. So this is already a huge change from the liberalized Christian worldview that we've been talking about for the past few minutes, let alone from the traditional view that we started from. And the new holders of this view will feel like they've moved miles away from that traditional Christianity. But it still leaves intact the ideas that those essentially perfect and sinless humans were left in charge of the garden, or maybe the planet, but in some metaphorical way they made a choice that leaves the rest of us in a fallen, broken state, running away from God.
Right.
This Christian worldview that comes from taking that hop and a step, the first two parts of our triple jump analogy, that describes where I myself was at during my 30s and 40s, and maybe you too, Scott.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, it's fair.
Now, in my 50s and 60s, every time I tried to fill in the details of that new worldview, I kept stumbling on exactly how God would have been orchestrating those biological evolutionary steps, and I kept coming up with nothing. Nor could I find anyone else in all my book readings and my podcast listenings, not a single scientifically credible, intelligent design advocate who tried to fill in those blanks with any mechanistic detail. How did God use evolution to specifically create hominids? And this explanatory gap became a bigger stone on my shoe when I added in a part of our theology that God had a specific goal in mind, that humans were what he had always intended, even 13 billion years ago. And let's be honest, we often hear Christians reminding themselves and other believers gathered around them saying, God knew you before you were born. And at this point, they'll often be quoting Jesus, talking about the number of the hairs on your head and things like that. And to make the problem even worse, as I learned more and more about intelligent design and seeing it as a thoroughly flawed explanation, especially, Scott, when you and I did that mini-series of episodes a year ago. That would be episodes number 130 to 136. And we talked to one of the original, the OG intelligent design proponents, Michael Behe himself, and to another up-and-coming ID proponent, Jonathan McClatchy. It became increasingly clear that my reasons for rejecting intelligent design, and that reason being that so many of the designs we see in nature are clunky, some of them are even malevolent. Again, the childbirth and choking on a piece of steak are the two examples I kept coming back to. Those reasons also directly undermine this Christian belief that God orchestrated evolution with the end goal of producing Homo sapiens.
Yeah.
I can't have my cake and eat it too. So then I get to the third maneuver in this triple jump analogy. I've taken the hop and the step of accepting longer timelines and God using biological evolution rather than the potter's wheel. But now it's time to fully commit to taking that third long jump of accepting that God wasn't actually intervening in the process, gently nudging it along. Instead, it was random. And it just happened that Homo sapiens emerged on top after 13.5 billion years, and I just happened to be one of those Homo sapiens. My being here on this earth is a product of an infinite series of accidents. And I can accept all of that and still call myself a Christian. I'll explain that last point in a few minutes, but Scott,
Well,
maybe
I guess
you want to
for
say something here.
me, because I've thought a lot about this as well. I think it can be a both and, or there could be some sort of synthesis. In other words, does it have to be that you either say we came about through pure chance and accident? And those are all kind of loaded terms in a sense. Even the issue of randomness is a pretty deep philosophical issue that's much debated amongst philosophers and physicists and so on, what truly is random and that kind of stuff. But my point being that I'm not sure, for me at least, that I have to make a choice. I think I can believe in a completely random process, a non-interventionist in the sense of the ID understanding that God kind of dips into this process once in a while and rejigs it or moves it in a certain direction. I think that's kind of a pretty last gasp effort, at trying to get to bring God into the picture. So I think I can totally accept that and still accept that. And I'm going to say somehow, and that won't be very obviously convincing to our materialist friends, but that somehow God is behind that random process. I guess one of the things theologically that I often have thought about is that if we believe, as Christians generally do, that we were created to glorify God and enjoy Him forever, as the Westminster Confession says, if we believe that, the only way
Right.
that God would get any joy or glory out of creating something other than himself, something separate from himself, would be if that was done in freedom. It couldn't be rigged, because if it's rigged, then
Right.
what's the joy in that, right? Like it's kind of like, I love board
Right.
games, right? And
Yeah.
so I could buy a board game and I could rig it so I always win or something. I could cheat, right? And of course, video
Yeah.
games, people get these cheat sheets and stuff like that. But there's not much joy in playing a game like that, right? Because there's no sense of accomplishment. You didn't really, right? So in my
Right.
mind, it's at least
Yeah.
possible that if there is a God, that he created something in total freedom. He didn't intervene. He didn't rig it, and so on. And evolution makes actually a lot of sense in that scenario where, right? So I guess that's
Right.
how I have reconciled,
Yep.
but that's kind of the understanding that I guess I've come to.
Right.
Yeah.
And I may have a different viewpoint, but I'll just remind you, we were going through the Pew results, and I did say back there that a significant percentage of religious people still will agree that it was random, that God had nothing to do with how evolution turned out. And I mentioned that was highest amongst Jews, Buddhists, and Hindus.
Right.
50 to 60% of them would say that. But there was 10 to 20% of Catholics
Yeah.
and mainline Protestants
Yeah.
who also would say, yeah, it was random and God had nothing to do with it. Now, that also means that 80 to
Right.
90% said
Right.
God did have something to do with it. But I'm going to put myself in the 10 or
Right.
20 that said, no, I think it's pretty random. And amongst evangelicals, even 6%
Yeah.
would nod their head
Okay.
to that idea. So
Yeah. Yeah.
that's what Pew says. That's what Pew got from the people.
It's interesting to
So,
me that I guess since the Enlightenment and the rise of the scientific age, where mankind became empirical, we decided that we need to look at stuff, we need to examine stuff, and that's where we need to draw truth from. That theologians and Christians also bought into that basic belief, and so they've been looking in nature for God. Where can we find God in nature? And before Darwin, it wasn't maybe as difficult because they could say, well, look at us, look at the beautiful world we live in and the beauty of nature, all that kind of stuff. But then empirical analysis came along and it started to show a different picture. And so there's been this fight. So one way to deal with that is the way that ID people try to deal with it, by arguing against that and saying that no, we can still find God in nature. Okay, it's true we can't find him for most of evolution, but every once in a while there's these, like Behe talks about evolution's edge, there's these unexplainable leaps that you can't account for if you don't believe that God did it, kind of thing. So until science shows us that there was another way to do it, those are the gaps that we'll fill in with God. But they're getting closed more and more and
right.
more
Yeah.
all the time. Yeah, I
Unfortunately.
remember
Yep.
I
God gets
was in a
smaller.
class once and we were talking about some of these issues and so on. And one of the students, kind of out of frustration, said to the prof, why is science always the winner? Like, why is it that we think there's this area where scientific explanation, can't account for and so on, but then it turns out it can. And it just seems that everything that theologians have proposed seems to end up losing to the science. And that was kind of an interesting
Yeah.
statement.
Yeah.
He was obviously frustrated. Yeah, yes,
A lot of
yes.
nervous laughter
Yeah.
in that classroom. So those are just some of the questions that come up in a thinking Christian's mind when you start grappling with the recent discoveries of ancient hominid ancestors. 1,000 questions that come up directly out of that classic faith versus evolution dilemma. What does it now mean to say that we're created in God's image? If there was no actual Adam and Eve, are we really all fallen creatures and broken image bearers? Have we all rejected God and rebelled against him, or have we as a species always been looking for God and trying to find a better morality? If God didn't intervene in any way in our evolutionary journey, does he intervene in our daily experiences? Does he grant us traveling mercies on a long road trip? Does he answer our prayers for a job or a healing? And as tough as those questions can be, those are actually the low-hanging fruit. There's much bigger questions higher up in the tree, and those take a bit more work to get up to. I've just started to notice some of those tougher questions. My previous Christian theology had God interacting with Abraham when Abraham was still a Babylonian, and in order to make sure we Gentiles also get included in that great deal made with Abraham's descendants, we invoke Abraham's ancestors. We trace genealogical lines that converge on Adam, who we would say was everyone's ancestor, and in that way we make Abraham's story our own. But now I don't believe in a literal Adam. And in fact, I now realize that any ancestor of Abraham that you want to talk about, that ancestor also had ancestors. There's no place in which one can say, here we have the first human that ever existed. The scientific evidence now suggests that humans, Homo sapiens, go back a few 100,000 years. And as we keep walking backwards in time through that ancestral tree, we find branches where one of our great-great-great-grandfathers not only produced us, but also our cousins, Neanderthals, for example. Aren't they entitled to the same divine promises that we claim through that ancestral lineage? And how far back can we go and still keep extending this human-divine relationship? What defensible reason can a thinking Christian give to say, no, it only applies to these individuals here, in this place and time, and not to any other ones?
Good questions. The more you talk, what's the answer? Yeah.
What's the answer, Scott?
Well, I think the more I listen to you articulate these things, the more I realize how not scientific the Bible is, right? Like it's not telling the story of human origins.
Right.
That's not the story it's telling, right? And once you get past that, I think it can then take a different place and be a fascinating story. But if you try to make it the story of human origins, which of course many do, in fact, even people who do believe in evolution still kind of see the Bible as the story of human origin in a certain sense, right? That, like you said, of Abraham being the progenitor and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, to me, it's very liberating to realize that, the Bible is a work of literature written by people who lived in a very different universe than I live in, and a very different understanding of that universe. And it very much reflects that, as we've discussed in many episodes. And those people are telling a story of their journey, their spiritual journey. And so it's just not the right questions. If we start to ask it questions about things we've been discussing, then I think we'll just be frustrated. Yeah.
Right. Scott, I want to put another layer on these kinds of questions. As we stretch our theology to include not just the humans of 10,000 years ago, but also the more ancient humans of 100,000 years or more, who might have shown some kind of awareness of a higher being, a Yahweh, and had qualities that we attribute to the image of God, things like compassion, for example, should we also include Neanderthals who also built societies and showed compassion? We have the evidence for that, and seemed to have a belief in the afterlife and presumably in deities. Just like us humans, their cousins at the time, or maybe a little bit later in time. but they just had the misfortune of going extinct before they could develop a full belief system, anything like the one that a metaphorical human named Adam might have had, or that Abraham had. Or maybe they had developed such a theology before they died out. There's many examples of how the Neanderthals might have come up with technologies that preceded our human ones. Why couldn't they have come up with theologies that preceded ours? And then I hear of the recent discoveries of Homo juluensis, who had the brain capacity that far exceeded that of humans today. Even Neanderthal brains were dwarfed by those of Homo juluensis. Maybe Homo juluensis also worshipped the same deity that we humans later called Yahweh.
I'm sitting
what do you
here
think of that?
With my brain spinning. Yeah, I mean, especially, like, I think the way this discussion has arisen maybe is that the discovery of extent of Neanderthals' civilization and cognitive abilities, and the fact that the really shocking fact of interbreeding, that we actually, I mean, they've been able to pretty definitively show that the Neanderthal DNA entered the human genome. And so if we have their DNA even, then are they subhuman when we have their DNA? Well, how? But we're part Neanderthal, in a certain, right? So then we're subhuman. It's something that really merits, a lot of thought and discussion.
Oh yeah, I mean, in some ways, for some people, Christian theology is very much about genetic lineage.
Yeah.
Being a descendant of David or a descendant of Abraham, a descendant of Adam. In Jewish and Christian thinking, these have huge theological implications. There seems to be some kind of genetic inheritance that we can get from those individuals, just like in original sin theology, we can inherit sin in a genetic fashion. And here's where I'm going with this point. As you just said, Scott, we are genetically related to Neanderthals and Denisovans. We now know that Homo sapiens were able to produce viable offspring, hybrids, with Neanderthals and Denisovans. Everyone alive today who's not from Africa, in the recent sense of that word, all of those carry Neanderthal and Denisovan genes. Humans left Africa and encountered Neanderthals and Denisovans who had already left Africa hundreds of thousands of years before, and all started mixing up the gene pools, if you know what I mean. And listen to this. More recently, scientists have identified certain genes in people from West Africa, which are different from the genes in European humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. And this leads those scientists to conclude that there was some other very ancient hominid in Africa a million years back that was interbreeding with a hominid ancestor that eventually gave rise to the European humans.
So what you're saying is even in Africa, there were subspecies like pre-Adamites, if you want to say that, but so not just in Europe. Wow, that's amazing. So even the Africans that left Africa and eventually became Homo sapiens, or were Homo sapiens, basically they were the result also of interbreeding with other species in ancient Africa. Wow, yeah, that's amazing.
Exactly. Yeah. And here's the point. Modern Christians, at least some of them, seem to have the audacity, conscious or otherwise, to draw an arbitrary line in the sand between Homo sapiens and those three other Homo lines. And they'll claim it's only at some point in the Homo sapiens line at which God became interested in earthlings. Everyone who existed more than 800,000 years ago is irrelevant. And I want to put some numbers on this. I'm a scientist. If life first appeared 3.5 billion years ago and you only start attributing relevance to the last 800,000 years, then 3.4992 billion years of existence and all the life forms of that time, the ones that came and went, all of that is irrelevant. And when you do the math, that's like saying when you slaved over some project for 10 hours, a typical working day, forget about what you did during the first 9 hours, 59 minutes, and 52 seconds, because the only thing that counts out of everything you did in that whole 10-hour day is what you did in the last 8.2 seconds. And so God starts this cosmic project and then waits patiently, hovering over Earth for 13.5 billion years, just waiting for those humans to appear. And then once we arrive and we've spent 7 seconds of that metaphorical workday on the planet, God sends Christ in the remaining 1.03 seconds. I've done the number crunching. in the remaining 1.03 seconds in that 10-hour workday again, and then decides it's time to close the book and shut down the whole universal project. Everything on earth comes to a grinding halt. There's some kind of a judgment of the humans. The earth and the heavens get incinerated, according to John the Revelator, and time stops. Eternity begins. This is the current state of Christian theology.
Yeah, well,
I think we need to
do some serious rethinking in light of what
Exactly.
we're learning, for sure. Because what you're describing is absolutely right. Like, that is how things have been seen. But I don't think they have to be necessarily seen that way. One thing that comes to my mind is that what is the fundamental, here's the big question, right? What is the fundamental thing that makes us what we call human? What makes us image bearers? And that's, of course, that's widely debated amongst not just Christians either, philosophers. And of course, it's becoming a very, very important discussion given the rise of artificial intelligence now and ideas like transhumanism and so on and so forth. Understanding what it is to be human is really becoming front and center again.
Okay, Scott, I want to do one more layer, and I promise this is the last one for today's episode, but it gets more complex, and I spent too much time sitting by the pond thinking about it. My brain was just spinning, and it's your job, Scott, to keep me grounded here. So this comes out of my questions about maybe expanding our Christian theology to include our Homo cousins from the past, who might have also been on the same spiritual journey toward discovering God that we humans have been on. But what about others from the future? What if the John's apocalypse doesn't happen, and life on Earth continues on for another billion years, but during that time we humans go extinct, just like the Neanderthals did, maybe because we annihilate ourselves with nuclear and biological weapons? Quite frankly, I don't think that's at all an unrealistic possibility, unless you're the type of person that says it can't happen that way because our Christian theology doesn't allow for that. I think we could easily do that. And so Homo sapiens scorches the face of the planet, and over the next billion years, out of the ashes, other organisms continue to evolve into species that far surpass our own. Species that are as far beyond us as we are from the chimpanzees, or Australopithecus. Maybe they're more aquatic organisms that live in the oceans and they were protected from all the nuclear and biological weapons. Who knows? But they too find God on their own spiritual journey. Or maybe there's life on other planets in our universe which are also on their own spiritual journeys of finding God. Those scenarios might otherwise happen except for this. We humans have this Christian theology that sometime in the near future, some say it'll happen any day now, or more liberal Christians among us will say it might be hundreds or 1,000 years from now, but at some point, our God is going to blow the whistle, call the game finished, usher all the humans into heaven where there's going to be some kind of a decision about the winners and the losers, and then our human theology says God's going to destroy the earth and the heavens because it's been contaminated by human sin. And he'll make a new heaven and a new earth and a new Jerusalem. John the Revelator, another human, tells us that the New Jerusalem is going to be a really great place for humans, with walls of jasper, gates of pearl, and streets of pure gold like transparent glass. Or some of us more liberal Christians, all humans, will quote the words of Jesus, another human, who talked about setting up a kingdom, which is a human construct, a New Jerusalem, again human, on earth where humans live. That may not be the greatest place for the aquatic creatures that might eventually survive our nuclear and biological warfare, or the aliens from Alpha Centauri, except that neither of those civilizations will get the opportunity.
Welcome to Luke's nervous breakdown. He's decided to actually, do it on air.
You're not too far from the truth, Scott. But my point is, those other beings, those other civilizations that might grow out all of that will never come to be because we have this human theology that the universe is going to be burned up before they have the chance to develop, just like our poor Neanderthal cousins. And I know it sounds crazy, Scott. You're stifling the need to burst out laughing, and I'm having a lot of fun letting the gears in my head spin wildly out of control. But to end on a serious, rational point, I'm also just trying to say that maybe our Christian theology is all too human-centric. The God of the universe who exceeds all possible concepts of space and time was hovering over Earth, waiting for us humans to appear on the stage. And when we did appear, all the other species get relegated to a lower shelf of lesser importance. Real history only begins when humans appear on the cosmic stage. God only interacts with humans. He's only got plans for humans, so we say. But when Jesus spoke to Nicodemus in John 3:16, he did not say for God so loved humanity that he sent his only son. Jesus said for God so loved the cosmos, the universe, that he sent his only son. And so my point is, I think we need to make room for a broader, more inclusive theology.
I can only say amen to that. So yeah, and of course, you can go all kinds of directions, but I totally agree with your bottom line there, that Christian theology has been very human-centered. That this is all about us. And you can understand why that would be, because first of all, because we're human, because that's what we care about, right? But again, like I've said on previous issues, right, I don't think it has to be seen that way. And I think that's what you're saying. And I agree 100% with that. We could just be, it's interesting. The JST, is that right? The JSWT or JWST, JWST, the James
Space
Watt
Telescope.
Yeah. So the big telescope.
Yeah, James Watt.
The really big one. It has, every day I get things. It's changed everything, and it's hard to know what it really has changed. But one thing that does seem to have changed is our understanding of the vastness of the universe itself. Areas of the sky that we thought were fuzzy dots are actually hundreds of thousands of more galaxies and so on. Like, it's just, if it wasn't mind-boggling before, it's just even beyond mind-boggling now. And here we are in this little speck of vastness, and yet we're conscious and we're thinking and we're having, it's wild. And so what we're realizing is we're just a speck, we're just a part of this incredible vastness. Could that not be true in theology? If we really believe in an infinite God, could we not be a speck in his universe? That maybe we thought we were maybe we have to have a Copernican moment, right? Where we realize that, if we believe in God, we believe that he loves us and so on, but it doesn't have to mean that it's only us. And it would really kind of make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So, so I think that's it's a great path to explore, and I know that's what we're going to be exploring for the next little while.
Exactly. So, boy, do I have questions. And why did we go through this long preamble, this 50 minutes or 55 minutes? It's all a preamble to what we're going to do in the next several episodes. Those questions started percolating in my head when we started working on the episode that looks at science education and science denial, the one we released last week. That idea started with realizing that 2025 is the 100th anniversary of the Scopes trial, which was really all about humans evolving, humans being created. And 2025 was also the 20th anniversary of the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial, which was really about intelligent design. And, in a way, the 50th year anniversary of the discovery of Lucy, one of our oldest hominid ancestors. That was discovered 50 years before November, just a few months back. That's when these questions started screaming in my head, and I decided I wanted to talk to a theologian about those questions. I had the same motivation when we talked to Dr. Andrew Torrance a year ago in episode 150, and to be completely honest, that left a lot of my questions unanswered, partly because we just didn't have the time to dig deep. So we're working up another interview with another theologian, Dr. Otati, whom we had on a few months back at the beginning of the season, and we'll see what answers we can get from him. But in working up that episode, I remembered a book that unpacked the exact same science clashes with theology scenario back in the 17th century. I won't get into the details right now, but we'll also do an episode with the author of that book, David Livingstone, and his research done on the pre-Adamites, the ancestors of Adam and Eve. We realized we should also do an episode that helps you, the listeners, appreciate the continuity between humans and the other hominids, us Adamites and the pre-Adamites. And so we've got another episode lined up that gives you the perfect analogy of human evolution, because this is a form of evolution that we all experience on a daily basis. It's the evolution of the English language. With Dr. Gareth Roberts. So, once again, one of our episodes grew into 2 episodes that in turn doubled into 4 episodes, and we're also working on a 5th one that might join those 4. And then we'll wrap up the whole miniseries with a mailbag episode where we ask our listeners to send in their comments and questions to the whole miniseries. What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, no, it's exciting. I think it's great, and I think our listeners are going to be intrigued and really enjoy it. It may, as we often do, it may just raise more questions.
Oh, it always does.
Concrete answers, but this is not the place to look for definitive answers.
Right.
But it is a place to explore, so I'm looking forward to it.
And a quick sales pitch. I did write a book a short while back about the evolution of humans and how that affects our Christian theology, so you can go to the show notes. There will be a link there. You can check out whether the book is for you. And with that, we're going to sign off, and we've got 5 great episodes coming to you in the next several weeks.
Great.
See you then.
See you then.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.